Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to say welcome again in this week now for a next edition of our Boni podcast. It's my pleasure to introduce Emily Johnson to you. Hi, Emily. Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Good to have you with us. Emily is working as a research assistant and project staff at our Department of Innovation and Digitalization in Law. She started there in September 2018, and since then she has been quite intensely involved in many of the key projects that we are dealing with, in particular in the field of data protection, but also in intellectual property law in quite some different aspects, not only police and security related, but also when it comes to social platforms or when it comes to medical issues of information security. Emily is one of the key people to ask because of her most distinguished background. Emily is British and she was also educated in the UK. She holds an LLM from the University of Edinburgh in technology and innovation and the law. She finished this in late 2018, and before that she was at the University of Southampton, qualifying with an LLB from 2014 and 2017. And as I said, since September 2018, she is with us in Vienna. Really pleased to have you there. At the moment, actually, you are not in Vienna, but you are in your home country. Emily, how are you and where are you exactly at the moment?
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. So I'm in the UK in the family home at the moment in a little village, just probably about 60 kilometers west of London. It's very quiet here compared to what's going on, but we're all isolating, following all of the rules in the UK.
Yeah. And how is daily life there at the moment?
For now, it's just staying at home, going out for our once a day exercise, which is permitted under the law at the moment. Occasionally going to the shops. We're not required to wear the masks like you are in Austria at the moment, although some people are. And it's all about going out only when it's absolutely necessary.
Yes. Okay. So no masks. This is part of the official policy at the moment because masks wouldn't be available, or because the government thinks that they are not useful, or.
I think it's a combination of the two, actually. So we've had a big issue with getting hold of medical equipment in general in the UK, particularly for NHS staff and care staff. That's a huge issue. And I don't think that there's been an overarching policy from the government that it's entirely useful and necessary at the moment.
Actually, the government policy in the UK was, at least from an Austrian perspective, rather different from the very beginning and not really consistent because at the beginning, at least from our point of view, as I say, at the beginning, the UK was not really very quick and not really very harsh in starting with measures of social distancing. And then suddenly the policy changed quite quickly. And now it's some kind of mixture in between, in a way, isn't it?
I wouldn't say it's a mixture, but I would absolutely agree with what you said about the kind of indecisiveness at the beginning.
Yeah.
So, I mean, laws were brought in already in February that the whole lockdown could happen and could be permitted under law, but nothing really happened until the end of March or the second half of March, where basically we were told we should social distance, and then no one really followed the rules, particularly in the big cities. And I'm sure you and many of our viewers saw the images on the London Underground where they were just packed as usual and people were out in parks as usual. And then when the lockdown came into force on the 23rd of March, I think it was, then I think in general, people have been sticking to the rules, and that comes with the just general necessity for going out. And I mean, where I am, it's very quiet and you only see people going out to the shops and that's about it. But I would say in the major cities, particularly as we've had really excellent, uncharacteristically British weather at the moment, people have been going out and trying to enjoy themselves a little bit. So I would say in general, people are following the rules and the rules are there, and they're not overly strict, but they're strict enough that I would say people are abiding by them and police are enforcing them. Not too strictly at the moment, or at least not too harshly.
So what exactly are the rules? Are you allowed to leave the house for leisure purposes, for example?
So not strictly leisure purposes. So there's basically 4 rules. So you can go out for shopping for necessities, so that's food and medicine. You can go out for one amount of exercise a day, and there's no time restriction on that. It just says once a day. Then you can travel for work, but only if you can't work from home, and then for medical purposes. And so that could be a doctor's appointment, and that also extends, for example, to caring for a vulnerable person or donating blood.
Okay, and that means, for example, that the underground in London is still running on a normal level. And
well, interestingly, the decision was made to have less trains on the London Underground, which has meant, which in my opinion is a funny decision, because you think that maybe more trains or the same amount of trains would be better, so then people can social distance effectively. But we have less trains. The idea is that there would be less people, and people are still using it, I suppose, to get to work, perhaps to get to parks. It's not clear, but social distancing, I think, is difficult still on the Underground.
Yeah, in particular in London, I think, I mean, everyone who ever was in London knows that the situation in the Underground is quite intense, or stuck, I would call it. Right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, and is there any political debate on whether this is sufficient at the moment, or do you think that the population, in particular in London, supports the intensity of the measures?
I would say, in general, public in general think that this is sufficient, and I think most people are sticking to it across the country. And I think that the government would be reluctant to put in any stricter rules, given the situation as it is. I think, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, when it comes to the numbers, simply to the figures, how is the UK doing at the moment? Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry, go
So
ahead.
when I checked this morning, we had around 16,000 deaths, which is quite significant. Confirmed cases were about 120,000. But the biggest problem that we've had, as you may have heard, is the testing. So in total, we've tested about 370,000 people. And we're averaging about 20,000 tests a day, which is kind of problematic when you compare to countries like Germany, who were obviously really big on the testing, or South Korea. We're really not doing great. So the aim was, from the government, by mid-April to be at 25,000 tests a day. And on Saturday, that was only at 21,000. So the plan was to get this up to 100,000 and 250,000, but we're simply not on track for the amount of tests.
And why is this? Because there is simply a lack of material available on the market, or is it because organizational issues?
I would say it's a combination of things. It's part of that lack of decisiveness at the beginning, meant that we were not able to get hold of it, or there wasn't a decision made to get hold of enough tests. There's also an issue of the fact that while we have really excellent research facilities in the UK, we simply don't have the scale to produce the tests or perform the tests. And from what I understand, also there's real big issues with getting hold of just simply the swabs or the reagents needed to examine the virus. And I think one article I was looking at said that the cost of the swabs have now gone up 100% since before the virus. So there's competition all throughout Europe, and the UK were particularly late to the game. So simply don't have the resources. Although we have set up now, so tests have been done at hospitals, and there are now, I think, 29 drive-through test centres in the UK. So you can just literally turn up at the in your car, open your mouth, someone swabs you, and then you receive the test back. But it's still not sufficient at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, from a continental perspective, a strategy which is not doing a lot of testing and not doing really strict measures of social distancing, at least in the major cities of a country, is a rather dangerous strategy, or risky, at least I would call it a risky strategy. Is there any serious, I asked this already, I mean, but let me ask the question again, any serious challenge or debate on this from the opposition, let's put it like this? So is everyone in agreement with this on a political level in the parliament, or?
So in terms of the social distancing?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's unanimous that this needs to be done.
Yeah, but it's relatively weak. I mean, if people are still allowed to use the underground without masks, and if people are still, and if there are less trains and more people in the trains, et cetera, there are quite some measures which could be clearly more intense taken then.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly could be stricter. I don't know if this is a deliberate decision because so that whether or not people continue to get infected so that we build up some kind of herd immunity. I'm not sure what the reasoning is entirely. And also so that people kind of keep a certain level of sanity so they can go out. And I mean, you know I mean, you've visited London, it's very densely populated. The population of London is almost the same amount as the entirety of Austria.
Yeah.
So I think and there's quite some really tiny flats or tiny living situations. So if it means people need to get out or want to get out and visit a park, and it means maybe they have to walk or take a train, maybe there's been some kind of decisions there to accommodate for different demographics of society.
Yeah. And when it comes to the situation in the hospitals, is there, I mean, are there enough beds in the ICUs, for example? Is intensive care still available for everyone, or is it already, is the system already at its limit at the moment?
So I would say actually one, I think good move by the government was to introduce what's called Nightingale hospitals. So these are basically pop-up hospitals. The first one was in East London in it's called the Excel Centre. It's a huge convention centre, and it was set up with the help of the army, and it has an extra 4,000 beds. And this is supposed to be for like intensive care. So when patients arrive there, they will be essentially already on ventilators and will only leave once their treatment has ended. And there's a plan for a total of 7 of these Nightingale hospitals. And the aim is to take the pressure off general hospitals so that they can treat, firstly, people without the coronavirus and continue normal treatment. And also just to kind of manage the situation better. And for example, the first hospital of these Nightingale hospitals was, I think, put up, in 9 days. Amazingly, which I think is quite impressive, and they seem to be helping the overspill. And I think in terms of numbers, the hospitals are currently managing.
Still, I mean, that sounds a little bit like the stories you hear from China, right? That in a minimum period, new hospitals are built. But if there is already not a sufficient amount of masks available, I would also assume that there are plenty of issues when it comes to ventilators and other material that is urgently needed in ICUs. Is there, in your view, any debate about the health system as a whole that is ongoing again now? Because the NHS was quite intensely debated in the UK already during the last years. And as far as I know, also one of the important factors when it came to the debate about Brexit, NHS was also one of the issues that were quite intensely debated because of its costs and so on. So is there any change in this political debate ongoing at the moment?
I would say in terms of political debate in that area, it's kind of been put on hold because we have, apart from the huge appreciation which everyone now has for all of our health workers and the NHS in general, we've had huge issues when it comes to the personal protective equipment, the PPE. So we simply don't have enough. And now there's guidance coming out that health workers should reuse the equipment, or that for example, yesterday we were expecting a shipment of something like 40,000 aprons and other equipment from Turkey, which it was supposed to arrive yesterday, it didn't, it's supposed to arrive today, so far it hasn't, and there's been reports on the news that will either arrive later today or tomorrow. But this has been a real big issue because I think the entire outlook by the public is that NHS staff are on the front line of this battle, as with all medical staff everywhere, and they're simply not equipped to fight it. And that's a real issue. So you have problems with staff. Not only can they not protect themselves, but then they may be reinfecting or infecting other patients simply because they don't have the right equipment. And there's also now been issues not only with the NHS staff and hospital staff who don't have the equipment, but also staff in care homes or in prisons, for example. And that's been a real big debate. And I think the government in that sense has really fallen short.
And do they have an explanation for this? So what is the official statement of the government when it comes to shortage of protective equipment of health personnel? I mean, that's something I would expect, which is a serious problem for anyone defending the policy.
Yeah.
So how do they do this, and how do they? Do you think that they are successful in convincing people that it's a kind of force majeure that is happening here?
I don't think they're that successful in convincing people. There's been a lot of frustration. I know that they've said now, the government has said that it's critical that we get the PPE in. That's one of the priorities at the moment. There's not been any real excuse as to why this has been the case. I think it's probably not the best organization, and the obvious issue with the competitive market at the moment with getting hold of this and then being late to the game again, as with the tests.
And do you think that, I mean, being late on the market and being competitive on the market has also something to do possibly with no longer being part of the EU, right? Because at least in some of the European countries, we see not a lot, but in some very small pieces, some kind of solidarity or unified approach or common approach to try to get material on the market and then share it within the European Union, giving it to those who need it the most. And the UK obviously is no longer part of this infrastructure. Is there any debate about this at the moment?
So there's actually not much debate at all about when it comes to the EU and Brexit. It's been totally eclipsed by coronavirus in general. But I would say that there were some recent meetings with the EU regarding getting hold of ventilators and other equipment. And from what I understand, there were some communication issues. Let's say that was the excuse that was given on both sides, apparently. But I think it was also the UK expressing the fact that they kind of want to handle this on their own. But I have no doubt that if you're part of a kind of a union, that it could only serve to help.
Yeah, so that's my question, right? Because I mean, being rather naive probably in this, but if I have a market with hundreds of millions of people, and I need to buy something on the global market and then distribute it with 100 million people, it's probably easier than doing this as one single country. And I would expect that somebody in the day-to-day political debate talks about that, but you tell me that that's not the case.
Yeah, I would say it's not at the forefront at the moment when it comes to political discussion.
So how about the fact that the prime minister was infected himself? Does that play a role in the assessment of the political situation at the moment?
Well, I would say in general that the politicians and the government adapted quite well to that situation. So obviously he was in an intensive care unit, although it was said he was never bad enough to be put on a ventilator. And he was released from hospital, I think it was Easter Sunday, and then was on video call in a suit and tie praising the NHS. And during that time, and as is still the case now, because apparently the Prime Minister is kind of resting up and recovering still, we have the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, who's kind of taken over the responsibilities of the Prime Minister. So, and I think so far that's in terms of leadership, things are running smoothly. There's not been any major issues, I would say.
Although he was not the only one within the government who was suspected to be infected, right?
Yeah.
I read a little bit of criticism about the fact that he was tested very quickly, whereas other people wait long or don't get the test at all. Is this correct? And if so, how is the debate ongoing on this?
So this was particularly an issue, I would say, at the beginning, but again, it's one of those things that's been overlooked. So where we have members of the royal family, even celebrities, politicians, all being able to get tests. Whereas ordinary everyday people, if you're not a key worker or, for example, working for the NHS, then it's very difficult to get hold of a test. That's been a real issue. But I think for the most part, unless you're a vulnerable person or a key worker, many people are taking the stance that they simply, the resources should be given to those who need it because they're so scarce at the moment.
And within the community of health workers, when they are not sufficiently protected, does that change anything in their moral at the moment and in their approach, or are they still simply taking this as something they can't change and do their work in the best way they can?
So I would say there are mixed views on this. I know I think the Guardian reported something like there have been around 81 deaths of health workers because of the coronavirus. So that's obviously, as any death, it's kind of awful, but it's particularly deaths that may have been prevented through the personal protective equipment. I think there's mixed thoughts on this because one, the medical staff have a duty, and they certainly have a duty of care to the patients, but they also have a duty of care to themselves, and then not to reinfect patients or to be able to make it home to their families. So there's the idea that they should continue and just battle on with whatever they can and whatever they can put together. And then there's also, and I have friends in London who are work for the NHS, and they are of the mind that they don't want to put themselves or other patients in danger. So, but it's kind of a catch-22 in that sense, when you have patients that are dying and they're in critical condition. So yeah, it's very difficult. And then you have to think about yourself.
Yeah, must be very, very, very difficult, really. I think that's, at least from an outside perspective, it's clearly more stressful than the situation as a whole looks clearly more stressful than it looks, at least currently, here in Austria. When it comes to day-to-day life of students, are universities closed? Yes, I assume that there's no teaching at universities, right?
Yeah.
So there's home learning everywhere, just like it's here in Austria.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And does that run properly in your perspective? I mean, I would assume that the UK is doing quite well in this because e-learning and e-teaching is quite common there already. So I would assume that there are not too many problems when it comes to adapting teaching to the new situation. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, I would say obviously every university is different in this sense, but on the whole, because many institutions already operate distance learning as a standard, so and recording and so on. So I would say in general, this is running quite smoothly.
Yeah, and in particular, Edinburgh even offers an LLM in the field, which is completely based on distance learning, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of.
Yeah, that of course doesn't. I mean, that's one of the programs that probably profits out of the situation at the moment. How are they doing the testing there, by the way? Is it everything is open book, I assume, right?
So I'm not sure. I haven't looked exactly at the decisions that have been made, but I have, for example, my sister who's at Southampton Solent University, and the decision was that it was open book for some of her exams, and then others have been postponed, and some have been postponed, for example, to August, which is where normally people would take resits from the June or July exams.
Yes. And I mean, is there, for example, in the legal community or in the legal teaching community, a serious debate about whether testing on open book basis is serious testing, or do people simply take this as granted that you can assess legal knowledge by open book tests?
Well, actually, some universities do that as a standard anyway, but I would say that really depends on the institution.
Yeah, because as you certainly know, this is one of the hot topics here in Austria at the moment, in how far it is possible to do exams in the legal domain using open book test rules instead of the usual 5 hours period in which you need to solve a given case. And there are quite some people who are reluctant that changing the system would work without clearly reducing the complexity of the case or the questions asked.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So then one of the reasons why the UK is always very interesting for continental lawyers, in particular when they are a little bit sensitive in data protection, is that the UK has a very different approach, in particular when it comes to video surveillance and policing on the streets already in times that are less stressful than the corona period at the moment. So how is all this policy enforced at the moment when it comes to restrictions and social distancing?
So it all started with the health and protection regulation, which was brought in on the 10th of February. And this is brought in very quickly. I think in the same day that it was put forward, it was brought in. And this is because it was done under the Public Health Act, which is a 1984 statute. So this is brought in as a piece of secondary legislation. And basically, was able to enforce the lockdown in the case that there's a serious and imminent threat to public health because of coronavirus, and obviously there was. And then later, after the announcement of the lockdown, so 3 days after the announcement of the lockdown, another law was brought in. So the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Regulation. And this is what restricted the movement, restricted the opening of businesses, the ability to gather in groups. And then this in turn allowed for the police powers when it came to restricting and monitoring. So the issue was, though, that the police had to have a reason to believe that one of these restrictions had been kind of contravened, and then two, that it was necessary and proportionate to kind of police this and the way in which they were policing. And so obviously, as you may have seen in the news, we had big issues with the use of drones. So a big one was in the Peak District National Park, where people were out walking, which technically they are allowed to do because that's one of their exercise a day. And as far as I know, they were also using the correct social distancing measures and so on. But drones were flying over and surveilling them. And there was a lot of criticism. I think even Big Brother Watch came in and said this whole thing was sinister and unnecessary. We even had the former Justice Secretary who said that this was completely kind of over the top, really. And it comes down to, as we always, this is always the case when it comes to limitations, it's a matter of necessity and proportionality. And it's about assessing whether it's really necessary to send out a drone to surveil people in a national park who may be abiding by the law. That's a huge question. We also had, I think it was Surrey Police, sent out a drone which is called Sky Talk, which sounds very sinister and something from sci-fi films, where basically it would fly over parks and open areas and call out to people that were in groups and say, this is a police message, you need to disperse, go home, and so on. And the argument from the police in that regard was that it's easier because it's faster, because you don't need to put police then in danger. But then there's a question of the overzealous policing, basically. And I know we had then kind of a comment from the human rights group Liberty, which said that while everyone's coming together as public, and this is all working, the lockdown's working, and this is not an issue, the potential overzealousness and hard-handedness of police could basically undermine all of that. And that's been a concern.
Yeah. And are there any cases already brought in front of courts because of this? So is anybody officially filing a claim that you are aware of against those drones, or is it just political debate at the moment?
I think it's just political debate at the moment, at least that I'm aware of.
Okay. But if I wanted to challenge this as an individual, could I? And if so, how? What should I do? I mean, if I were one of the individuals being affected by such a drone in the park, what could I do?
Yeah, so I'm sure you could, and I think that would be a matter of contacting your local authority and asking what the reasoning was behind this, and then assessing. I mean, you'd have to employ some kind of legal services unless you're a lawyer yourself, and then perhaps putting it in front of the court. So the courts are still operating as a necessary service, or like a key service, basically. But I would say this would probably be a slow process at this time.
Yeah, and you are not aware of a single case. So
at least not at the moment.
NGOs don't do this at the moment.
No, I've only, from what I'm aware of, there's been comments from NGOs, but there's been no single case on this so far.
And the drones are still flying, or did the police stop this then after the outcry of the public?
So there seemed to have been kind of a turnaround in police approaches when it comes to tackling the situation. So the obvious issue was the overzealousness of police in the beginning, which I think is possibly due to the ambiguous law that was put in place. It was not clear exactly why people are outside, how you assess whether or not the reason they're outside or whatever they're doing is valid. There's no requirement for proof of anything. So after that, the kind of, I would say it was almost like a transitional period. This is a new law, right? And it's about, in many ways, trial and error in this sense. I mean, I don't agree with it, but there were some mistakes, I would say, when it comes to overzealousness of surveillance. But from that, the government has come out with further guidelines. So to suggest examples of why people are allowed to go outside, and then there have been police guidelines to, instead of simply enforcing the rules and imposing fines, which they could impose £60 fines for the first offence. It's then changed to more of an explanatory thing. So where police go along, they talk to a person, explain, you must go home, this is why you need to go home. And only then, if it's necessary, they may literally drive them home or arrest them or impose the fine.
Mm-hmm. And isn't there, I mean, that sounds so interesting, I would call it, that on the one hand, they try to enforce social distancing in parks using drones, and at the same time, on the other hand, the London Underground is running on with a reduced amount of trains, which is obviously leading into a situation where people can't really practice social distancing, which sounds a little bit contradictory to me. Does the police handle this contradiction, or is it simply ignored? Or
I would say, from what I've read, the focus seems to be when people are outside doing things. And I think maybe it's because of the fact that it's difficult to manage the situation on the underground, and maybe there simply aren't enough police to manage the situation.
Yeah, and doesn't that remind many of the British of some kind of Foucault-style surveillance state?
Yeah, certainly, perhaps that's the case.
Yeah, but it doesn't change. I mean, it's something that people who have a little bit of a privacy tick are interested in, but the general public doesn't care too much. Or
oh no, I think they do care. I would say they do care, even people that aren't interested in law. Hence why there was the change in police approach, and we haven't seen so much on the drones or police. We had policing in supermarkets of certain aisles, and that's completely stopped, from what I understand. So I would say the general public and the general outcry did have an influence on the police approach.
Okay, so that's a little bit more positive then, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about the media? Are the media supporting the government, or is there a clear? Is there some criticism also coming from? Let's put it, for example, the BBC, or how is the BBC doing at the moment? What are they doing?
Yeah. So I mean, the BBC is supposed to be impartial, right?
Yeah.
I'd say across all media, and as with the BBC and the Guardian, for example, I was looking at the Times. There's a general kind of disappointment in the way that everything's been handled, particularly with regard to the amount of resources and the protection of the NHS staff. That's been a real big thing. Just this morning, I read a Guardian article literally listing the 5 shortfalls of the UK government. And I think they haven't been holding back in that case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the Guardian is probably not really the journal everyone on the street reads, right? So it's and yeah, but still, yeah, obviously. Okay, do you think that, I mean, when it comes to the overall political situation in the UK, do you think that the government is struggling when it comes to the very fundamentals, so that there is a serious risk that that you would have a change of government because of this crisis, or is it more that that this will not happen because crises like this one here tend to support the position of government at least on a midterm perspective?
Yeah, I would more agree with your latter suggestion. I think that in general, political issues, when it comes to kind of which side and political agendas, have really been put aside. And like, as is the case with Brexit, it's been totally overshadowed by in favor of public health, basically.
Yeah. By the way, Brexit, I mean, there is a deadline running, which is quite close. Do you know anything about whether there are thoughts about extending again the deadline, or I mean, how should that ever work? It's, I mean, I don't know. I read something, I think 2 weeks ago, that negotiations are still ongoing between the EU and the UK, but I would assume that there's not too much to be negotiated at the moment because of the overall chaos. Do you know anything about that? And do you know anything about the internal political debate about this?
Yeah, so when I was doing kind of recent research, I think that most of the negotiations have basically halted because they've been so eclipsed by the coronavirus. From what I understand, there's an option to extend the deadline beyond the 31st of December, but this has to be agreed by both sides by the 1st of July. And it's kind of mixed in the UK. This morning there was an announcement from a member of the Scottish Parliament saying that we should absolutely extend it, given the current situation. And these are such exceptional circumstances, and Brexit's such a serious thing, which needs full attention and resources, I think. But then there's also, on the other side, we have people saying, you know, actually stick to it, stick to the hard deadline, that it's perhaps that coronavirus is going to be, or the situation is going to be more manageable, let's say, from a political point of view. But I would say it's generally mixed. But it makes, in my mind, rational sense to be able to focus now on public health above all things, and then political agendas and situations when it comes to Brexit at a later stage.
Yeah, but if nothing happens now, the outcome of this would be that end of December we have the hard Brexit and no further debate about this, and I would assume that would put further chaos in the country and produce further chaos in the country, and also in the European Union. Then, I mean, having a corona crisis, which is probably not over in December, and a hard Brexit. Wow, I mean, yeah, but there's no official position of the government on this yet, and not even informally they are I mean, setting their claims or something. So
No,
unclear.
at least nothing from the top, anyway.
And would you personally think that the risk of a hard Brexit has increased now?
I don't know. I have mixed feelings on what the actual decision would be. I would like to think that there was some level-headedness here, and this situation is extreme enough and extraordinary enough to postpone Brexit so that we can seriously think about the situation while still focused now on public health and human lives, basically, rather than politics and who can fish where. I mean, it seems Brexit's very serious, right? But it seems almost trivial in comparison to the current situation. So in my mind, it would make sense, absolute sense, to extend the deadline.
Yeah, okay. May I slowly come to an end, Emily, and ask our viewers, if you have any questions or comments, please do so. Ask them in the comments of this live video. May I slowly come to an end, Emily, by asking you whether anything that you see on Austria, how Austria deals with the situation, as far as you can assess this. Is there anything that you find remarkable in a positive or in a negative sense, or is it just that you don't see anything which is outstanding or very, very different from the perspective that you have in the UK?
I would say that in general, it seems like Austria is handling things. I mean, from the perspective of the UK, where Austria doesn't get, it's not the most talked about, right? But I would say that Austria seems to be handling things quietly and well, I think. It seems, from what I've understood from the numbers, the death rate is like leveling out, if not decreasing. People are just getting on with things, trying to stay positive. So I would say that in general, Austria is handling it well, looking from the UK.
Yeah, although that's a very positive and optimistic view. There are also more negative views, obviously, but overall, I think many people share your point of view. Actually, we've got one question, which is concerning contact tracing. There is wider support in surveys by the public in the UK, for example, compared to Austria. Do you think that this is due to differences in understanding privacy in the law? Oh, that's a very fundamental question.
Yeah, good question. So I would say in general, so from what I've looked at, the main contact tracing app comes from the NHS, NHSX, which is basically the innovative arm of the NHS, and they're working in combination with Oxford University to produce this contact tracing app. I'd say that one of the biggest kind of points that was put forward was that this should be voluntary. And I think if that is the case, then there wouldn't be so many privacy or data protection issues. And it's been highlighted that we should absolutely focus on privacy and data protection, but there's been absolutely no steps on how to do this, or no action plan on how to do this.
Yeah. quite the same here, by the way. I mean, there's a similar app here in Austria at the moment on the market, and there's also a debate, or I mean, there's no longer a debate because everybody agrees more or less that it should be based on informed consent to use that and not on a law. But the typical outcome of this will be that if you simply put it on informed consent, there is a serious risk that not a sufficient amount of people will freely give their consent on using this, which then again leads into a debate whether this is of any use.
Yeah, we've had exactly the same. I think there has to be something like 56% of the population has to actually use it for it to be effective.
Yeah, and at the moment the numbers are probably clearly below that, right?
So, yeah, I mean, it hasn't even been released yet.
Yes, because it's technically not ready, or because the legal assessment is not done yet?
I would say it's probably more of a technical thing.
Yeah. That's another issue, which is that many of those apps simply do not work at the moment, right? So they are, from a technical point of view. Okay, no more questions from the audience. No more question from my side. Emily, is there anything that I should have asked you and that I didn't, and that you would still like to share with our audience?
Not that I can think of, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time. It was really great having you with us, Emily. All the best. Stay safe and stay healthy and take care. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing you again in Vienna, and then drinking a cup of coffee or a glass of wine in this beautiful city.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm so looking forward to coming back.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.